year 1933, the Queen of the Seas was born, the most famous ship in the world. And this is her story. The liner, the Queen Mary. On board the ocean liner, the Queen Mary, during those dark days of World War II, behind locked doors, vital decisions affecting the whole future of mankind were taken. And it must be stated, on behalf of the American city of Long Beach in California, that it was a wonderful idea of theirs to buy and then preserve this unique vessel, using part of her interior as a nautical museum, in which to display some of the history that helped to make America great. In wartime, the youth of America and her allies crossed the mighty oceans in this wonderful ship to fight in the cause of freedom. And sadly, many of them gave their tomorrow for our today. Now, this may sound a little unusual, because we're really beginning this story at the end, by asking a question to the very last captain of the Queen Mary, Captain John Treasure Jones, about his personal feelings when the ship was finally sold into graceful retirement.
Well, I've been called a bit of a traitor for my views on this. In many ways, I was very pleased that the city of Long Beach had bought the Queen Mary. And some of my reasons were selfish. I didn't think they could keep this ship in this country because of the climate, and the cost of keeping a ship like that in decent condition would have been exorbitant. And the climate in California would help them to preserve the ship out there. And the city of Long Beach had bought her to enhance their own city, not to make a quick buck out of her and get rid of her. They wanted her for keeps for hundreds of years to come, to attract people to the city of Long Beach. And those are two good reasons. The third was, in all my years at sea, I'd never been round Cape Horn. And the only way I could take the Queen Mary to Long Beach was round Cape Horn, but that was purely a selfish reason, of course. I didn't feel too nostalgic about or upset about it. I thought it was much better than taking her to a scrapyard. I didn't want to do that, take that lovely ship to a scrapyard. And I couldn't really think of a nicer place to have taken her.
Here again is a personal view from another of the liner's captains, Commodore Donald MacLean.
My own feelings about the matter were quite pleasant, and I thought it was a very good ending to a noble ship, and knowing she'd be very well looked after, which she has been. And I think it was the finest thing that could happen to a ship in her old age, because she lives in dignified retirement now in Long Beach.
And now you're going to hear the fascinating and sometimes surprising story of this wonderful ship. Surprising because her designers, instead of setting out to create the world's largest liner, in effect did exactly the opposite. They wanted to build the smallest liner, but one, of course, that would fulfill certain conditions. Sir Percy Bates, who was then chairman of the Cunard line, announcing to the world at large that the Queen Mary was actually the smallest and the slowest ship that could be made to fulfill the conditions required to accomplish a trouble-free transatlantic service. And now we invite you to settle down and listen to this audio adventure telling the true story of the Queen Mary. Yes, the Queen Mary. During her career, she carried over 2 million fare-paying passengers and steamed over 3.5 million nautical miles. Someone once writing that she was above all else the nearest ship ever to become a living being, because she breathed, had character and personality. One may well ask, how did all this come about? When, for example, does the real story behind the Queen Mary actually begin? Certainly the three numbers 534 play an important role in her creation. But the true seeds that germinated into this wonderful ship actually go way, way back to the middle of the 17th century, because it was then that relatives of a certain Samuel Cunard emigrated from Wales to live in America, in Philadelphia. Samuel Cunard, by the way, believing implicitly in the future of steam, which he turned into a reality with his first Royal Mail paddle steamer, the Britannia, which was built in 1840. That little wooden paddle steamer, the Britannia, only 207 foot in length, bravely commenced a regular passenger service on July the 4th, 1840, when she steamed across the treacherous Atlantic Ocean from Liverpool to Boston at a speed of 8.5 knots, carrying on her two decks 115 passengers, plus a cargo of up to 225 tons. Her voyage of 2 weeks and 8 hours then being considered a major success, and it was such an important historical event that the good citizens of Boston presented Samuel Cunard with a silver loving cup, given in recognition of the very first arrival of the Britannia. The Cunard Company in those days was known as the British and North American Royal Mail Steam Packet Company, and though their first iron ship, incidentally the first ship to be propeller-driven, was called the Andes, and that was in 1852, all the rest that followed were given names that ended in the two letters IA. And here, in alphabetical order, is a selection of some of the names that they chose. For example, Abyssinia, Alsatia, Ondria, Aquitania, Asia, Assyria, Arabia, Arania, Bothnia, Campania, Carinthia, Carmania, Caronia, Etruria, Franconia, Hibernia, Lusitania, Mauritania, Media, Parthia, Persia, Scotia, Servia, Transylvania and Umbria. When you look back, it's surprising how many different names ending in IA Cunard managed to dig up. And when you think about it, in their time, what a great number of ships they must have owned. And so it was quite logical to assume, on hearing that the new ship may be named after a queen, that they would probably call it the Queen Victoria, Victoria. And with this in mind, a myth suddenly grew up. And it was that either Sir Percy Bates, then chairman of Cunard, or Lord Roydon, a personal friend of the King, at a suitable opportunity approached King George V and asked if they may name the new ship after the most illustrious and remarkable woman who'd ever been Queen of England. To which the King immediately replied, "That is the greatest compliment that anyone has ever paid to my wife." A rather nice story, but absolutely untrue. You see, when eventually Cunard amalgamated with the White Star Line, it was decided that they would then break with their previous tradition of Cunard ending every ship's name in IA and White Star in IC, with such vessels as Adriatic, Baltic, Britannic, Celtic, Germanic, Majestic, Olympic, and of course the ill-fated Titanic. And so, what better than for the new company to choose for their proposed Queens of the Sea the actual names of queens, and of course beginning with the reigning Queen of the day, Queen Mary. If you're wondering, as many people do, how it came about that Cunard, back in the 1930s, actually decided to build an ocean liner of over 1,000-foot length with a breadth of 118 feet, then we must go back to the year 1923, when Cunard suddenly discovered that the newly introduced American immigration quota system had now killed off their rather lucrative emigrant passenger trade. And so, looking ahead, it was pretty obvious that if they were going to survive at all, especially with an ever-increasing foreign competition, their future lay in a fast express Atlantic passenger service, but one that would only be profitable if, they could build just 2 ships which were capable of sustaining a weekly service without any major repairs at all for at least 11 months of the year, and ships that were comfortable and fast enough to attract first-class passengers away from their other competitors, and 2 ships that were going to last for at least 25 years. And both of these new liners would have to be capable of travelling each year a distance of over 145,000 nautical miles. And to achieve this, they would require not only fantastically reliable boilers, but engines powerful enough to make up any lost time that may occur due to bad weather conditions. And so it came about that in 1926, Cunard began to plan for the first of these new ships. And the problems that they faced were enormous. To give you an idea, supposing they chose diesel engines, what would happen if there was a sudden oil shortage? And of course, when you're building a giant ship, actual physical weight becomes an all-important factor, especially when it's applied to the engines and boilers. They tend to make the upper half light or top-heavy. And in a ship that's over 1,000 feet long, actual height itself can also become a problem. Consider, for example, the necessary plumbing that would be required. Sinks, baths, wash basins, toilets, etc., with miles and miles of water-filled galvanized iron piping, adding tremendously to the weight of the upper structure itself. Quite a problem, isn't it? But they managed to overcome that. Cunard's designers, making an elaborate study of plumbing installed inside American skyscrapers, eventually came up with a one-pipe system, which, by the choice of copper piping, not only reduced the weight by half, but also the cost as well. When you're planning to build the biggest ever passenger-carrying ship and a vessel greater than anything ever created by anybody, you're certainly entering uncharted waters. And no less than 16 scale models of different shape and design had to be made and tested in around 8,000 experimental trips, which were run up and down water-filled tanks. Those models, some of which were driven by electric motors operating 4 propellers, travelling a distance of over 100 miles. And over 1,000 experiments had to be carried out with miniature 24-inch propellers. And when the real propellers were finally fitted to the ship, they were so delicately balanced that it was claimed one man could actually spin them by hand. And all this had to take place long before construction of the real ship could begin. You may think, because the Queen Mary was registered in the English port of Liverpool, a town, by the way, that is now perhaps better known worldwide as the home of those famous 4 pop musicians, the Beatles, that is where the ship was built. But in truth, she really should have been painted in Scottish tartan, and perhaps even flying a sporran from her mast, because she was born in John Brown's shipyard, beside the River Clyde, not all that far from the famous Scottish town of Glasgow. Rather surprising when you hear that her actual home was considered to be the port of Southampton, situated right down in the south of England. When you contemplate building the largest ocean liner that the world has ever seen, you're bound to run into a considerable number of problems. For instance, will the different ports that you propose to visit have suitable facilities to handle not only a ship of such vast size, but the additional passenger load with their baggage? And can they swiftly provide fuel, water, food and other necessary items, especially when the ship is aiming at a fast turnaround? Thinking ahead, what happens when it's time for an annual overhaul? Where do you put such a large ship? It certainly needs a very big dry dock. So who's going to build that and pay for it? In fact, the situation at one point became so serious that Cunard actually announced, no dry dock, no Queen Mary. As history now records, in spite of all the apparent insurmountable problems, on the 1st of December 1930, Cunard gave orders to start building the giant liner, a vessel far greater than anything previously envisaged, and, as some people claimed, the ultimate ship. To the local people, this was an important historical event, as they began construction of the ship number 534, where, working continuously night and day, employing 3 shifts of men, the keel and the whole skeleton of the hull was actually completed within a year. Way back in those early days, did Captain John Treasure Jones ever imagine that perhaps in the future he may become captain of one of the Queens?
Oh, I certainly hoped so, yes. It was my one ambition, was to be captain of these big ships. Although I first joined the White Star Line in 1929, as you know, the big slump came in and we were soon out on our years, and I didn't rejoin the Cunard White Star until the end of 1936. Then still hoped that I would get command of one of the Queens before I retired. And I was lucky, and I did.
This was the beginning of the 1930s. And sadly, the whole exciting project of the big liner began to dim, cloaked in the mists of the depression which now crept menacingly around the world. And at noon, on the 11th of December, 1931, Cunard issued instructions saying all further work on the liner was now to cease. For the people of Clydeside, whose livelihood depended solely on shipbuilding, this was now a major disaster, and a tragedy that deeply touched the heart of Britain's Prince of Wales when he inspected the stagnant, rusting skeleton of the Queen Mary, being told at the time how it could represent employment, life itself, prestige of the British Empire, and possibly the blue ribbon of the Atlantic, to which he immediately reacted by contacting the government of the day. An inquiry by Chancellor of the Exchequer Neville Chamberlain led not only to a complete investigation of British shipping, but also the merger of 2 great companies, Cunard and White Star, and on the 3rd of April 1934, work recommencing on the Queen Mary, when early in the morning hundreds of men happily marched behind the Dalmuir Parish Pipe Band back into John Brown's shipyard, a familiar location, which had now laid idle for over 2 years. And ahead of these men lay 2 rather unusual and unexpected tasks: chipping away 130 tons of rust that had accumulated on the liner, and the removal of thousands and thousands of birds which had happily nested in both the scaffolding and the crane's gantries. That recommencing of work soon spread like the roots of a giant tree all over Britain, affecting many areas, as if an industrial revolution had taken place. Firms everywhere now making products for the ship. For example, Rugby, 7 turbo generators. Walsall, 400 tons of high-pressure tubing. The Potteries, 200,000 items of crockery. Clydebank, hundreds of rotary turbine blades. Sheffield, steel castings, forges and cutlery. Liverpool, £10,000 worth of glass items. London, propeller castings. And so the list goes on and on and on. Anchor chains, chairs, carpets, light bulbs, bell pushers, bedding. All of it destined to end in the giant ship known as 534. And so it was that the world's newest and largest ocean liner slowly began to take shape, though nobody as yet knew her proposed name. But on the afternoon of Wednesday, the 26th of September 1934, at exactly 10 minutes past 3, and for the very first time in history that an actual reigning Queen of England had consented to name a ship, Queen Mary announced to the world
I am happy to name this ship the Queen Mary.
At this point in time, Lady Mabel Fortescue Harrison, an astrologist, made this prediction.
The Queen Mary will know her greatest fame when she never sails another mile and never carries another paying passenger.
The Queen Mary will know its greatest fame when she never sails another mile and never carries another paying passenger. To actually launch the ship, which of course at that stage was nothing more than a white-painted empty shell, was simply done by pressing a button, while a bottle of Australian wine was smashed against her port bow. To tow this great ship to her fitting-out basin, a 2-mile stretch of the river had been widened by 100 feet, apart from considerable dredging of 1 million tons of soil, and the destruction and removal of an unforeseen underwater outcrop of rock. And now this giant ship began to take shape, designed in part to offer the ultimate in luxurious, gracious living, though it was questionable if her future passengers would become aware of some of her unique features, the greatest of them being the woodwork. 56 of the rarest woods in the world were collected from forests and used in the ship, some of them for the first time ever, and nobody realizing in those days that she was destined to become the very last 3-funnelled liner. The main dining saloon, which could seat every single first-class passenger at one sitting, was nearly half an acre in size, and it was the largest room ever built in any ship. In fact, 3 of Christopher Columbus's original sailing fleet and the whole of Samuel Cunard's first paddle steamer, the Britannia, could have been fitted comfortably into it. One of the features of that room was a unique decorative map, 24 foot by 15, showing clearly, by the use of a crystal glass model of the liner, her relative position when crossing the Atlantic. And looking towards the main staircase at the head of the first landing, presented to the ship by Queen Mary herself in May 1936, was a rare silk flag, the Queen's own personal standard, which was removed later by Cunard when they sold the liner, and it's now kept in a London safe. And if you had any ideas that it was wrong of Cunard to remove that flag, perhaps it should be explained that you can, of course, sell a ship, but not a treasured royal standard that was presented by a reigning Queen of England to that ship. While the ship was still being fitted out, and on a rainy day in March, the Prince of Wales, who by now had become King of England, Edward VIII, paid her an informal visit. Dressed in a sombre black overcoat, which had a big fur collar attached, and carrying his traditional bowler hat in his hand, he spent over 3 hours making a 7-mile tour of the ship, dodging the official party as often as he could, and inspecting everything, turning on taps in the cabins, testing chairs in the lounge, chatting informally to engineers and workmen, and to even getting one of the big engines started so that he could balance a coin on its edge to test it for vibration. At the end of the visit, as His Majesty's royal car began to drive him away, the Queen Mary's whistle was sounded for the very first time, echoing its characteristic deep note right across the local Scottish Highlands. Throughout the world, reports on the progress of the new liner now began to fill the pages of various publications, and articles appeared describing some of the staggering facts about the ship. 24 lifeboats, 10 million rivets, 38 public rooms, 18 watertight bulkheads, 257,000 turbine blades, 26 dog kennels, 350 miniature safes, 10 miles of expensive carpet, 2 radio stations, 600 telephones, 12,000 light fittings, 2,000 windows and portholes, and over 44,000 cubic feet of cargo space. The liner's oil consumption of over 1,000 tons a day, 2 swimming pools, both of which were capable of being filled or emptied within 25 minutes. One writer suggesting that if you wanted some real idea of the Mary's true length, and you happened to be in New York, then take a walk down Fifth Avenue from the Empire State to 38th Street. Or, if in London, then up the Strand from Charing Cross Station to the Savoy Hotel, which, on either side of the Atlantic, is in reality quite a long walk. And of course, there's always the hollow foremast, with its 110 steps leading up to the crow's nest, as described here by Commodore Donald Maclean, one of the Queen Mary's captains.
I joined the Queen Mary as a very junior officer, nimble and full of beans, and I was very inquisitive about what went on up there. Those were the days before the advent of radar, and the 2 men on special lookout duties were paid 10 shillings a month extra above the ordinary able seamen's pay. And I wanted to see just exactly what they had up there. And they had a little electric heater and a telephone there.
Talking about the crow's nest, here's a thought. In a rough sea, when you're up there, to put it mildly, it must be a little bit hairy. Captain Treasure Jones.
There'd be a big swing up there if the ship was rolling heavily. I don't know what happened if they get very seasick up there or not. But you'd cover a lot of area when you're going there. 20-degree roll up there, that height up. But it was confined space, so I've never been up there, so
You've never been up the crow's nest of the Queen Mary?
No, I've never been up the crow's nest. No.
There are really no words that could be used to truly describe the vast, great size of the Queen Mary. And when you're actually working on board, how long do you think it would take before you're able to easily find your way around?
Well, to find your way completely around the ship, you'd want a couple of weeks at least to know your way really around. But if you really want to know every hole and corner, it would take you years to find out every hole and corner and what it is for in those ships. They were so big.
In that case, was there ever anybody at all who did know the complete ship?
I should say yes. And possibly the sanitary engineer. He was with her when she was being built, and he stayed with her after we delivered her at Long Beach to help the city of Long Beach. And I'm sure he knew every hole and corner and rivet and everything in that ship. Now, he's probably the only one that really knew every hole and corner of that ship.
Fascinating, isn't it? That probably just one man in the whole world really knew the interior of that great ship. And is it a fact that after she arrived in Long Beach, things that nobody knew about were then discovered?
Oh, yes, all sorts of things were found, and I gather they came across quite a lot of table silver stacked away in some obscure locker which had never been used at all. It was still in its wrappings, and this was a great find.
What about the stowaways on the Queen Mary?
Oh, we used to frequently have stowaways. And I think at one stage, shortly after the war, there was a little business going on between some of the boys on the lower deck and getting people across the Atlantic as stowaways.
One interesting small highlight in the career of the Queen Mary happened on the very first day that she sailed, an event officially recorded in Lloyd's list of wrecks and casualties, reporting on the 24th of March 1936 that for a moment she actually went aground in the River Clyde, having touched South Bank at Dalmuir, but happily no damage was reported, and it was estimated that by special train, car, aircraft, bicycle, horseback, and on foot, 1 million people had come to see her off as she made her one and only 14-mile trip down the River Clyde. This was 1936, the year, in fact, that Britain actually began transmitting the world's first regular television service. And in May, in London of that year, at a famous restaurant, the Trocadero, no less than 5 separate nightly gala dinners were held in honour of the ship. the interior of the restaurant having been decorated to represent the Queen Mary, a transformation which was in its way quite staggering. One corridor entrance simulating Southampton docks, where, after cutting through a 2-foot-thick wall, the guests entered the ship by using an actual regulation gangway. Inside the restaurant they built to scale a captain's bridge and a 5-tiered deck, the scene being decorated with house flags of the company, navigation lights, searchlights and bells, and real lifebuoys from the Queen Mary herself. The guests sitting in deck chairs, being served by waiters dressed as stewards. An orchestra played from lifeboats, and dancing in the beam of searchlights took place on a raft moored beside the ship. Captain Sir Edgar Britton, then Commodore of the Cunard line and the actual captain of the Queen Mary, attending the first of the gala dinners, sitting with his wife and daughter at a captain's table. On a very dull, grey, overcast afternoon, at precisely tea time, exactly 64 days after leaving her fitting-out basin, the Queen Mary was now ready to begin her maiden voyage. And it was a very special day, not only for everybody concerned, but because it was also the birthday of the royal lady whose name she bore, Queen Mary. And prior to the official sailing, not only did 15,000 people make a tour of the ship, but a royal inspection also took place as well, when the Prince of Wales, who had now become King of England, dressed rather surprisingly in a flannel suit and sporting a straw hat, flew in his private red and white coloured aircraft from Fort Belvedere to join his mother in Southampton, where, with other members of the royal family, they had gathered to make a tour of the ship. And among them were the Duke and Duchess of York, later to become King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, with their children, Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret. And in the royal party were also the Duke and Duchess of Kent and the Duchess of Gloucester. Queen Mary plainly being heard to say, in a very loud voice, to the King on his arrival, "You would not have dressed like this if your father had been here, David." But apart from that comment, the tour was a wonderful success. And, just like a typical lady, Queen Mary showing special interest in the kitchens, speaking to the chef in French, where she watched their own royal lunch being prepared. The King remarking, "We're going to get something good to eat," having noticed the appetizing appeal of steaks being charcoal grilled, and adding, "That is the best way to cook steak." The princesses visited the children's playroom, sliding down a chute, followed by the King, who also had a go. Then they watched a Mickey Mouse film in one of the cinemas. The royal party going everywhere and seeing every part of the ship. And when they were showing Queen Mary one of the motorized lifeboats, they told her that it could actually carry more people than the whole complement of Cunard's original paddle steamer, the Britannia. The famous moment of departure had finally arrived, as 4,000 visitors were gently ushered ashore, and the press and radio stations around the world began to issue descriptive and often emotional reports of the sailing, reminding people that today was also Derby Day, when that famous English horse race was being held. Standing high up on a wing of the bridge, Captain Sir Edgar Britton now began to prepare for the sailing, while down in the portside engine room, 41-year-old Frank Gardner, an out-of-work builder's labourer from Cardiff in Wales, secretly stowed away. And, as if in complete contrast, film star Frances Day not only had her own Rolls-Royce shipped aboard, but several live hens as well, to provide her, as she said, with fresh farm eggs during the voyage, even though 50,000 eggs had already been stowed aboard the ship. Incidentally, every single passenger received a document welcoming them aboard, wishing them an enjoyable trip. A document which was signed personally by the captain himself, Sir Edgar Britton, who was now on the bridge as this vast ship slowly moved away from the quayside, being gently pulled and pushed by tiny tugboats. The Queen Mary's maiden voyage from Southampton to New York was of course via Cherbourg, where she took on board not only the rest of her passengers, but £500,000 worth of gold bullion, and as a gift to every single passenger, 3 bottles of champagne, presented by a French firm. And though faults actually appeared in each of the 4 high-pressure turbines, she managed to sail the Atlantic majestically. And as a tribute of respect, quietly, without ceremony, they dropped a wreath onto the sea when she reached the spot where, at 11:59 p.m. on a Monday in April 1912, the Titanic struck an iceberg and slid to a watery grave, taking with her the lives of nearly 1,500 people. And though the Queen Mary on this crossing broke no official records, she crossed the Atlantic at an average speed of just over 29 knots, her arrival in New York being an event that will never be forgotten. 3 Eastern Airlines planes, under the command of Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, were the very first to sight her, and one of them, circling low, actually dropped flowers right onto the ship's deck. So many telegrams were delivered to the ship that it became utterly impossible to distribute them, and they had to be sent back. Only 3 months later, the Queen Mary won the Blue Ribbon of the North Atlantic by travelling at an average speed of over 30 knots and completing the 2,938-mile journey in just a few minutes under 4 days. And now let's turn to some interesting details about the ship. And to those of you who may never have sailed on a large ocean liner, how do you visualize the Queen Mary, say for example crossing the Atlantic? Do you picture her in your mind as a large, steady moving platform? Because in one way, her original designers certainly did. So let's ask 2 of the great captains of the Queen Mary what they have to say on the subject. And we begin with Commodore Donald Maclean, answering the question, when did he first join the liner?
First time I went on the Mary was somewhere around 1936 as a very junior third officer.
And was it true that in those days the Queen Mary had no handrails at all?
The chairman was under the impression that she wouldn't roll since she was such a mighty vessel. She was a tremendous size compared with all ships afloat at the time. He was quite convinced by the architects that she wouldn't roll.
And here, in answer to the question, was the ship a flat, steady platform? Is Captain John Treasure Jones, the last captain of the Queen Mary.
You can't build any ship that will be level, true and flat when the oceans start to rage and those seas get up. And although naval architects and all the engineers, etc., thought that they wouldn't roll very much because of their size, they were very disillusioned. They didn't put any handrails on the alleyways and things for people to hold on to, and they became very necessary indeed, because they did roll. They rolled in many ways worse than perhaps some small ships.
And you may be rather surprised to learn that at times, under certain conditions, this vast ship developed a rather frightening corkscrew motion, which
was very noticeable in the Queen Mary, particularly with the quarterly sea, and she was very difficult to steer.
I've been in the Queen Mary when, and the Queen Elizabeth was just the same, in which I've seen them roll to 28 degrees either side, and that's a big roll.
no one, so it appears, because the liner was so strongly built, ever thought that she would roll in the long Atlantic swirls. And because of this, most of the furniture had not been anchored securely to the floor. But towards the end of her first 6 months at sea, during the middle of the night, a 55-mile-an-hour gale started, and then she really did go up and down. One stewardess saying that the violence was so great she was thrown right out of her bunk. And so on the next voyage, a small army of carpenters and joiners came aboard to rectify the situation.
She was fitted not only with handrails, but with stanchions all along the promenade deck, upper deck, fitted with lifelines in between these stanchions, and people were warned about going up on deck in very heavy weather. We noticed the female element of the passengers was dwindling to nothing. Wives and secretaries were left behind on the winter voyages.
And I can quite understand people not wanting to travel in the winter months when you're rolling like that.
The solution, of course, came many years later when they were able to fit stabilizers.
Now, when they did fit the stabilizers, they put 2 pair. One wouldn't have been sufficient. They had a terrific effect. Instead of rolling 20-odd degrees, you brought your rolls down to about 5, 6, or 7 degree rolls, which made life a lot more comfortable for everybody.
And she sailed beautifully.
Naturally, when the Queen Mary was new, many unforeseen problems had to be overcome, because she was not ideally the perfect ship, suffering extreme vibration, especially at the stern, which they greatly strengthened with additional steel beams, and then adding 4 newly designed propellers. Smoke was another big problem, the company paying out a lot of money in compensation to passengers for damage to their clothes. And the solution they found was to fit smoke washing devices inside the funnels. But apart from teething troubles, how did she really handle? Because after all, both of the queens were pretty big chunks of metal. Captain Treasure Jones.
Oh, they steer extremely well, yes. These ships with their speed and things were beautiful ships to steer, really. The ship acts almost instantly to your helm, and the faster you go, the quicker she answers. But, of course, if you want to turn right round, it's a big turning circle on those big ships. At least a mile, anyhow, at least. Probably more. To just alter course a little, no, you can do that almost instantaneously, just a small course. There were no problem to steer, and I just loved steering. I occasionally used to, particularly if I had a quartermaster who perhaps wasn't doing too well, I'd say, let me have the wheel for a moment. Although I said I considered myself a very good helmsman because I had to do a lot of steering in my young days. In either 1966 or 67. We were laid up for about 10 days to a fortnight, I think, in Southampton, held up. And when I eventually sailed, I found the ship was vibrating very badly and was about 1.5 knots down on her speed. And under the bottom of the ship, there were only very small barnacles, only very small, but that was sufficient to make a ship of 81,000 tons vibrate quite badly and take 1.5 knots of speed off her.
On September the 3rd, 1939, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain announced to the world,
"This country is at war with Germany."
The Queen Mary, having just carried a record 2,332 passengers, mostly American, over to New York, where she now lay, after the majority of her crew had been shipped back to England. And in 1940, a member of the British Houses of Parliament stated that he thought she should be sold, because such a large ship would be useless for any strategic war purpose. But even so, 7 months later, painted a dull bluish grey to tone in with the sea, the Queen Mary gallantly commenced her war service. Just after her new sister ship, the Queen Elizabeth, had made a secret voyage across the Atlantic and for 2 weeks was berthed beside her. Then, in Australia, the Mary's interior was stripped of peacetime fittings, while 10,000 valuable items of furniture had already been removed and safely stored away in Sydney, New York and Southampton's New Forest area, the liner undergoing extensive conversion, with, for example, her luxurious veranda grille now becoming an anti-aircraft headquarters.
During World War II, Winston Churchill sailed on the Queen Mary. Her speed, which was capable of 31 knots, was so high it baffled the U-boat. No U-boat could compete with that speed. And also, at the very end of each trip across the Atlantic, they were escorted by a B-51 bomber.
One could write a complete book itself on the Queen Mary's wartime activities, though at times she was a veritable floating Whitehall, and that was when Winston Churchill came aboard.
Yes, he had part of the main deck sealed off as his private quarter deck. He had all the military advisors he required, and he was in constant touch with Whitehall. They had all the very latest news coming in on special scrambler telephones, which gave them precise progress of the war.
Winston Churchill, by the way, had a wartime pseudonym, travelling as Colonel Warden.
And I understand that it was after one of these voyages in the Queen Mary that Churchill opened the secret document disclosing the particulars of the landing in Normandy, which was called Overlord.
During the war, she and her sister ship, the Queen Elizabeth, did a magnificent job in transporting troops, to start with from Australia up to Malaya, Suez, and Australia back to England, and then prior to the invasion of France, ferrying American troops 15,000 at a time from New York to Greenock.
At one time, I was told that she carried a complete American military division with all their equipment, consisting of nearly 18,000 men.
18,000 men on one ship. You would think that this would tend to make the liner top-heavy.
So if you look at pictures taken during the war of the troops on the Queen, there's hardly an inch to spare anywhere. But actually, she had so much in the way of stores and extra oil fuel and emergency supply. She was given a grant of being 2 feet deeper draft, which means she was 2 feet deeper in the water, and that compensated for the top weight on the upper decks. One of the prides of the first officer responsible for the upper deck fittings was the beautiful teakwood rail all round the Mary's boat deck. The rail being very badly cut up by the GIs, who were sentries, carving not only their initials but in many cases their hometown. And it had a great sentimental value for many passengers later on who were former GIs, and even went up to try and find out if their initials were still there. But anyway, Cunard, as a tribute to the GIs, many of whom never returned, kept this section of rail with these initials carved in them for quite a long period after the war, and eventually decided to cut out one whole section and present it to the American Army Museum in New York.
She had a magnificent record both in peace and war, and as Churchill said, she and the Queen Elizabeth, because of their carrying capacity of troops, shortened the war by about a year. And I don't think any ship could have a finer tribute to her than that.
It is pretty obvious that in the lifetime of any ship there are bound to be sad, tragic moments, and one, which was thought to be one of the best-kept secrets of the Second World War, happened in October 1942, when the Queen Mary, carrying 10,000 American troops to Britain and steaming at 28.5 knots in rather stormy water on a zigzag course designed to avoid lurking submarines, and not very far from Ireland, suddenly discovered that one of her Royal Naval escorts, with a crew of 439 on board, getting dangerously close, and before anything could be done, the Queen Mary caught the cruiser a glancing blow, which spun her around. And as horrified American servicemen watched from the decks of the liner, the Mary ploughed right through and over the cruiser, cutting it completely in half, resulting in 338 men being trapped, crushed to pulp, drowned, or chopped to bits by the liner's propellers. And though the Mary dare not stop, 99 seamen, 1 officer, and the Curaçao's captain miraculously survived.
I was in the Royal Navy at that time. I think I was in command of an escort vessel called the Sunflower, not very far away, out in the eastern Atlantic up there, escorting a convoy, when we picked up this signal about the Queen Mary overrunning the Curaçao and sinking her. We realized that it wouldn't do much harm to the Queen Mary, but it was fatal for the Curaçao. And, of course, we were shocked. It was most distressing for everybody's point of view that that should have happened.
A secret message, radioed in code and passed to the Admiralty in London, said that the HMS Curaçao had been rammed and sunk by the Queen Mary. it gave the exact location and added, Queen Mary damaged forward.
Made a very deep gash, about 15 feet gash in the bow. But they worked round the clock on arrival in Clydebank, right round the clock to repair the bow.
Let us not dwell too deeply on those tragic war years, other than to mention the hundreds of happy GI war brides who sailed to America on the Queen Mary. And in this respect, here is a story from Commodore Maclean.
One sunny morning I was taking my usual captain stroll along the upper deck, particularly around the area of the lifeboats, and I saw a bunch of American youngsters skylarking around the lifeboats, as boys will do. And I noticed one boy seemed to be taking charge of the others. As I approached them, this boy stood to a very military-looking attention and saluted me and said, "Good morning, Captain." So I said, "Good morning, Sonny. Are you feeling the motion of the ship at all?" And he was very adamant that he didn't feel any seasickness, because he said, "I was born aboard this ship." On inquiry, I discovered that his mother was a GI bride, and he was born at sea. I said to him, "You seem to boss all these other youngsters." "Oh, yes," he said, "I've got every right to be. He said, I'm a Queen Mary citizen."
I had a very regular lady traveling at my table, and I called her the last of the aristocrats of America. And she was quite an elderly lady. This lady was around 90. And she was a bit of a stickler for etiquette, but she was a most entertaining person to have at my table. And she used to keep my table in fits of laughter. And she was most unusual for an American, because we never got on Christian name terms. Normally with Americans you are on Christian names within the first 5 minutes. But one day she said to me, quite seriously at the table at lunchtime, "Captain, could you marry me?" "Oh," I said, "Mrs. Bruce Merriman, much as I might like to marry you, you know I'm already married." She blushed up all over her face and said, "Oh, Captain, you know I didn't mean that. What I meant was, if I wanted to marry somebody on the ship, would you marry me?" Well, I knew this all the time, but I was just pulling her leg for a change.
Sometimes in books, you read about the captain of a ship being able to marry people. Could a British captain on the Queen Mary perform a wedding?
No. I think in the old days they did, but certainly not since the Merchant Shipping Act of 1895. There's always a place in the ship's register for marriages, deaths, and births, and if somebody wanted to get married on board and there was some parson or something on board who was prepared to marry them, well, yes, I would have it registered in the ship's register, but the captain didn't have the authority to marry anybody himself.
Captain John Treasure Jones could, of course, bury somebody at sea, a task that sadly he has had to perform. What, in his words, were the duties of a captain of the Queen Mary?
I don't know of any other job quite like it. Here you are, you're entirely responsible for the whole ship, your whole crew, close on 1,200 and perhaps 2,000 passengers. You represent the Queen, the law of the land, you are the judge and the jury, and you're actually the parson on Sunday mornings.
On the very first day of a very new year, in January 1949, when laying at anchor in the French harbour of Cherbourg, the life of the liner, the Queen Mary, nearly came to an abrupt end.
Threatening weather suddenly erupted over the ship, and the squalls were reaching hurricane violence. And as we tried to weigh the port anchor, it was found that it was immovable. It seemed to be stuck somewhere on the bottom. We applied maximum electric power on the windlass, and eventually the anchor slowly broke surface, only to display itself badly entangled with 3 black, sinister-looking tentacles, each about 6 inches in diameter. These tentacles turned out to be sections of the secret pipeline running between Britain and Normandy to supply petrol to the Allied forces. This was known as Pluto, pipeline under the ocean. The wind was increasing in force with very heavy squalls of sleet, vivid lightning, and very heavy rain, and telephonic communication from the forecastle to the bridge was impossible. And we had to use a relay of messengers running back and forth from the bridge to the forecastle. And I well remember the French pilot, Monsieur Guy Freelot, coming into the chartroom and very gloomily observing to Captain Grattidge and myself, I was staff captain at the time, if the ship is too far up on the Celine bank, she will break her back when the ebb tide falls to dead low water.
A frightening situation when nothing further could be done. And if ever a prayer was answered, it certainly was that night.
Low water came, and yet the stout old Queen Mary stood up to it, although her bow was pointing up in the air and her stern was well down, fore end of the ship being on the Celine bank. Fortunately, tide was very high tide, and to our amazement, we slid off the bank. So Captain Grattidge said to me, I think I'll chance going full astern and go out of the harbour stern first, which is a very unusual sight. And that is what we did. We increased the speed and we increased the pressure on the capstan, and finally the Pluto line parted, and I realized that a prayer had been answered.
At 9:42 a.m. on the 31st of October 1967, the Queen Mary left Southampton for the very last time. Her destination, Long Beach.
From about 20 miles south of Long Beach, we were escorted by, must have been every boat that could float in California. And I would say, if there was one, there was at least 8,000 motorboats on the water there.
Very proudly displayed on his living room wall, Captain Treasure Jones has a big framed photograph showing the exact moment when a large Douglas DC aircraft flew low over the Mary and, as happened on her maiden voyage to America, dropped masses of colourful flowers onto her decks.
And that is one of the finest souvenirs that I think I could have. There's the ship, her last stay at sea, under steam, with this lovely aircraft flying over us, dropping flowers on board us, and autographed by the captain of the aircraft. To the captain of the Queen Mary, yes. Here was the Queen Mary. She'd finished her career at sea. It was the end of my career also. I never sailed again. I certainly achieved what I wanted to be, and that was captain of one of the finest ships built in Britain, and the Queen Mary, I think, was the finest. I loved being captain of the Queen Mary. Let's put it that way. Nothing ever made me unhappy while I was captain of the Queen Mary.